I run the Eagle Street Rooftop Farm. It's in Brooklyn, New York, in Greenpoint, and I also work at the New York Botanical Garden on a 2-acre vegetable garden site called the Edible Academy. And I additionally run a nonprofit called Growing Chefs, which does food education in schools.
Hi, I'm Bradley Fleming. I am back and forth right now between Brooklyn and New Haven, where I'm from. In New Haven, I'm working for a land trust, managing 55 community gardens and a youth program and an incubator garden program. And here in the city, I'm working on a few different projects, managing a small farm for JetBlue at JFK Airport, and working for the Doe Fund, managing community gardens for them, and consulting for Square Roots, which is an urban agriculture accelerator program growing hydroponic greens in shipping containers in Brooklyn, and a couple other things in the works.
Cool. Hi, my name is Nicole Baum, and I'm the Senior Marketing Manager at Gotham Greens. We have 3 rooftop greenhouses here in New York City. So this one over here, this beautiful painting, is actually of our location on top of Whole Foods in Gowanus, Brooklyn. I guess we'll probably talk a little bit more about the process and the coming into those greenhouses, but it's a really unique experience, and we also do weekly tours at that location. So if anybody's interested in coming hang out and checking out the greenhouse, that's every Wednesday at 6.
Hi, I'm David Graves. I'm from Beckett, Massachusetts, and I've been keeping honeybees on rooftops in New York City since 1996. My first hive location was on East 16th Street in Manhattan. A fellow by the name of Barry Benepe, the founder of Green Market, allowed me to put a hive there, and that opened up many doors for me. It's been an up and down thing. I've been dealing with colony collapse over the years. But I still am trying to keep bees, and I will continue to keep trying, and want to thank you very much for having me here tonight.
I think it would be helpful if someone on the panel wanted to give us kind of a brief history of this movement of rooftop farms.
Well, David, did you want to take a crack at that starting in 1990s or
Yeah. Well, my thought was that if I brought bees into New York City, I could educate people about honeybees and about urban agriculture. My first rooftop hive was actually in Williamsburg, Massachusetts on my dad's Chevrolet garage, and there's a lot of funny stories about that. But it's all about space, wasted space, and I think if we utilize that, and certainly here in New York there's a lot of space on rooftops, and that was my whole idea, is to acquire this space and utilize it for agriculture. And I think we've all done that successfully. At least I'm still trying with bees. I won't give up, like I said before, but we'll keep doing what we do best.
What I would add to that is that if you look at New York specifically, the first rollout of rooftop gardens happened pre-air conditioning. So in the 1880s through 1890s, all the way up through the 1940s, you see a lot of rooftop gardens on top of hotels, restaurants. The original Madison Square Garden building, which was designed after the Giralda in Spain, which is gone. It's one of those beautiful buildings in New York, and it's gone. But that had a beautiful rooftop garden. There were hotels that kept cows and chickens on top of their roofs, more as a advertising thing than anything else. And then you can look at early literature where people out in the Rockaways even talk about, first-generation immigrant families that raised grapes on top of their roofs. And again, they were really just looking for a respite from how hot it was in their apartments. So when air conditioning starts to get developed, and buildings start to get taller because of construction materials available, you see less and less emphasis on rooftop gardening. And then I think where that's experienced sort of a regeneration in what we're growing through is, as David mentioned, it's an interest in better use of space. And then from a perspective like mine, I run a green roof farm. We're coming from a perspective of being interested in designing city infrastructure that helps support some of the largest pressures on New York City, things like stormwater overflow, heat island mitigation, and then creating green spaces for pollinators and animals, and then of course to produce food for people. So what I think is so interesting is that I'm looking at green roofs from a background, basically like the technology starts to roll out around 1910, but is firmed up the way it is now around 1970. Hydroponics, Nicole might have a better grip on this, but it's been around for thousands of years, and it's in its current form probably for the last 50 to 60. at least. And so, you know, we're sort of in this great movement where we have the benefit of all of this history combined with some really cool technology. And then, of course, our cities need it more than ever because they're denser, they're more paved, and they're growing in population. Plug for me, I wrote a book. This is all in the book.
Nicole, do you want to talk about hydroponic farming?
Yeah. So it's a little bit different about our farm is that we're doing it in greenhouses. And as we all know, New York City has really tough winters. So the whole idea there was, okay, cities have a ton of unused rooftop space, and we can create year-round farms if we have an enclosed rooftop greenhouse. So we actually built our first greenhouse in 2011 in Greenpoint, not far from Annie's. And that was really the first commercial scale rooftop greenhouse in the country. It was producing about 200,000 pounds per year. And really, I think it proved that it could be a year-round kind of commercial scale product. So we're really focusing on lettuces and herbs, but hydroponics can be practiced and you can grow different types of things like, well, of course, lettuces, but also berries and fruits. Lots of tomatoes as well.
And then looking to the present, what do you see as the challenges for rooftop farms? Where are we at now with, both government, legislation, things like that? What are you dealing with?
Well, challenges is one, land, even if it's an unused rooftop, landlords want to get paid for it. So rooftop farms are probably the most expensive farm real estate in the world, I'd say. And then you've got labor, which is, the number one cost to farming, and people that are working for you need to live in this city, which is one of the most expensive in the world. So, I'd say those are the two biggest challenges.
Bradley and I both were involved in green roof vegetable farms, but the weight-bearing capacity of roofs is another thing. So there are structural challenges to this kind of work. And I'll mention for anyone interested, and hopefully everyone leaves this room dying to start a rooftop farm as beautiful as these, you have to have, in New York City, legal use requires a 42-inch parapet, legal access, which is at roof level. You can't just climb up your fire escape, jump over the ledge, and start a rooftop farm. And then I would say, in addition, Bradley's point is good about the labor being a high cost, but there are fundamental differences between the capital setup between a beehive on your roof, a greenhouse on your roof, and a green roof. And then most people end up doing containers. Big startup cost difference, and then big maintenance difference. And one thing there are simple things that you can have on your checklist, like do you have irrigation access? Do you plan on being there year round? Those kind of things are worth considering. But to the larger question that Elizabeth posited about infrastructure, I think the thing that's been really unique about the movement that we're all part of is that increasingly cities are responsive to this becoming something they facilitate. I mean, when we were first starting to look at doing a green roof on the Eagle Street location that we have, it's atop a private building, and the private building owner navigated a lot of those permitting issues through a green roof company. It was a relatively simple conversation. But at a larger scale, when a city is interested in supporting this and mandating things like green roofs, for example, I mentioned that a green roof is part of creating sustainable city infrastructure. So if you're looking ahead at the larger costs of redoing your stormwater system, for example, it's financially more useful to do something like create a stormwater tax so that if people don't put a green roof on their building when they're doing new construction, they're taxed, and then that money goes into basically maintaining the costs of the stormwater that's not being captured. So I hope that's not too roundabout, but there are cities that choose sort of between the carrot and the stick. DC is a city that, for example, when you build new construction, they charge for what your square foot would be in not collecting stormwater. So that would be considered, I suppose, the stick. Whereas in New York, there's a carrot. You can receive a tax abatement if you do the right thing. So an entire country like Germany has decided to go with the stick method. You have to install green roofs on new construction over a certain square footage in order to capture stormwater. And one of the reasons I keep looping back to stormwater, by the way, which I find it fascinating, we're an island, right? We're on an island right now, and we have the second largest coastline of any city in the world besides Hong Kong. So New York is really a city of water. And we don't really think about it, possibly because we're all kind of afraid to swim in the East River. But it's actually a really vital and beautiful space. And every now and again you see a whale swimming up the Newtown Creek, which blows my mind because that was the site of one of the largest oil spills in the country. So I think about stormwater as one of our primary reasons to do rooftop anything or green space anything, because that stormwater capture is such an important part of what our city needs to function properly. I'll say one more thing. We have a sewage system that's over 100 years old considering our population growth. So we're at a point now where the best thing you can do as a New Yorker is not flush your toilet when it rains. Because it's so bad for our city to have that stormwater overflow. It flushes all of our pollution into the water that surrounds us. So that's why I like green roofs. From an agricultural perspective, you cannot do better farming from a water resource management perspective than hydroponics. It's the most effective use of water, the least amount of water use for any type of agriculture. But, those are the things you kind of weigh out.
Can you talk about, are bees really disappearing? And can you talk about what's happening from your perspective?
Well, I started keeping bees here in 1996. And like I said, my first beehive was on East 16th Street. And then we got into the magazine section of the New York Times, and that opened up many doors for me, new buzz in Manhattan. So I put a hive up in Harlem at 116th Street over Amy Roof's restaurant. Those two locations did very well. And then I got another location on 85th and Columbus, which did extremely well. That was in the 90s. What do you see today when you get up on a rooftop and you look across the landscape that you didn't see back then? Cell phone repeater towers everywhere. The city is infested with them. Some scientists think that electromagnetic frequencies are interfering with honeybees' navigation. And when that happens, they cannot communicate to the rest of the hive where that source of nectar is. And that being said, they basically start to starve. The queen will not lay eggs if she doesn't see food coming through the front door. And when bees start to starve and start to die off, there's no eggs to take the place of those that have died. The hive gets smaller and smaller and then becomes susceptible to varroa mite, parasitic mites, tracheal mites. And eventually they can't stand it in there any longer and they abscond, they leave. And that's where in 2006, David Hackenberg on CBS reported that most of his hives were all empty. The bees absconded, they left, and for no apparent reason. That's what some scientists say, EMF is a culprit. There's also neonicotinoids, a systemic pesticide that gets through the whole plant up into the flower. The bees become addicted to it, much like we become addicted to nicotine. They keep going back to it. And what happens is they get disoriented. So that's another problem. Here in New York City, do they use neonicotinoids? I don't think so. Are there cell phone towers everywhere? Cell repeaters? Yes, there are. What pesticides do they actually use here in Manhattan? I don't think any at all, except for maybe to spray for mosquitoes now and again, but that's usually in low-lying areas. And if a honeybee came in contact with it, it wouldn't come back to the hive, it would die first. And only a third of the hive is leaving to gather nectar and pollen. So hopefully it's not EMF. I don't want it to be that, because I use a cell phone like everybody else does. They're convenient. They sometimes save lives. I worry about loss of habitat. In New York City, the city has eradicated knotweed. And that's an invasive plant that gets into vacant lots, but it's a huge source of nectar for honeybees in the fall. They need food for the upcoming winter. They need to build up their stores because that's what they eat during the wintertime. This past year, do you remember what happened in March? It got very, very cold. Cold for a long stretch. When bees cluster in the hive, they cluster and they won't feed. If it's cold for too long, they won't break cluster to feed on stored up honey. Subsequently, they starve. It's called cold starvation. That was nothing to do with neonicotinoids or EMF. That's a phenomenon that's happened this past year, and some would say it's all a part of global warming. So Anyway, the best thing we can do is try to educate people about rooftop gardens, rooftop bees, try to get the word out as much as we can. I take that observation beehive to many schools. Green Market brings in schools to me on a regular basis, and I teach children about honeybees and want to teach adults too. They are important. We wouldn't survive today if we didn't have pollinators. And one of the other pollinators that we could start to use is a mason bee, which build little houses with little holes in it. They don't sting, and they're very good pollinators. I think finally they listed the rusty back bumblebee in 2017, March of 2017. I actually think our president made them, they're extinct. They're almost to the point where they are endangered species. So we hope and pray that down south, that the hurricane didn't demolish a lot of the beekeepers that send out bees all over the country. In Moultrie, Georgia, I hope that they survive this last hurricane, because without them, I'll be out of the bee business.
Bradley, I was interested when you listed the things that you're doing. It was a very long list. And I thought maybe you could elaborate on some of those projects or the ones that you're most excited about.
Yeah, probably the one that I'm most excited about isn't super, it's in New Haven, so it's less relevant to everyone here, but I'm running a youth program called Growing Entrepreneurs, and we have high school aged kids from the city of New Haven that we're paying to operate a small market garden and sell food to local restaurants, and in the process they're learning entrepreneurial skills and business skills and customer service and all the stuff it takes to run a business. And this past summer we did a bunch of workshops with them and had them all brainstorm and come up with ideas for like offshoot startups, and some of them came up with value-added products they wanted to make. Some came up with, you know, little season extending tools like adding hoops. One of them builds raised garden beds for homeowners and installs them in their houses, and they're starting to pilot these businesses now, so that's super fun. Another one is Square Roots. They're doing really cool stuff. They are growing greens vertically and hydroponically in shipping containers in Brooklyn with LED lights. And like Annie said, the most interesting or the coolest part of that is using, you know, way less water than traditional agriculture, like 1/10 of the water consumption. But they do use electricity, and the cost of production is pretty high. So yeah, ideally they'll bring the cost of production down and it can be more accessible to everyone, and it'll be a cool way to save water. You can't grow everything in those systems, but one of the coolest things that stuck in my mind about it is like the more, you know, obviously we're a country that's becoming more densely populated in large cities. I think 50% of the population lives in major metropolitan areas, so you know, food can't be grown in those areas, so it has to be trucked in, which is a relatively small percentage of like the greenhouse gas emissions or, you know, CO2 emissions of the whole food system. But you know, we can save that by growing in the cities. But the cooler part is that if you grow, you know, the greens and the leafy herbs in the cities in these water saving systems, then you have the potential to take farmland out of production and like plant forests and, you know, do reforestation stuff and carbon farming. So yeah, that's pretty cool too.
Yeah, Nicole, will you talk a little bit about hydroponic farming? I have read that it's more sustainable than soil farming. Will you talk about that?
Absolutely, thanks. So yeah, it definitely can be more sustainable, but I think it always comes down to how you farm. So our farming practices are very kind of natural in the sense that we don't use any pesticides, and we're really committed to not using herbicides. We actually bring beneficial insects into our greenhouse every week, so that's kind of a fun process. You see our greenhouse assistants with this thing that kind of looks like a hair dryer, and they bring the bugs in and they put them into the hairdryer and you can just like watch them fly over the greens. They're pretty happy greens. But I think overall the whole process, and like Bradley said, we're focusing primarily on leafy greens and herbs because in New York City, you know, the product has traveled at least a week by the time it's reached New York. So 98% of lettuces and herbs in this country are actually coming from 2 states, California, which you guys probably all guessed, and the second one is Arizona. Yep, I know, who knew? So 98%. So from the time that that product is harvested in California, packaged, put into boxes and sold to a trucking company that will bring it across the country, it's at least 7 to 10 days old. And then it gets sold to another company that will sell it to different grocery stores. So by the time you buy a package of lettuce off the shelf, it has like maybe 4 or 5 days of shelf life before it goes bad. And that was really kind of the realization, that aha moment, when our founders realized, okay, we can do something better. We can do this better. So the opportunity there was really growing these greens in New York City, doing them the way we want to do it, without pesticides, and to create local jobs, and to be able to deliver a fresher, kind of better tasting product, and connect people with their food sources. So I think that's like a really important element as well. People in New York City don't necessarily think to go down the street and look up and that your local farm is on a rooftop. And I think all of us are about changing that and kind of connecting people to their food sources.
What is the key, do you think, to the success of the rooftop farms moving forward?
I'm 100% confident that that has to do with the way we vote and the way we ask our local governments to support the use of these spaces. Because, you know, even if private building, so there are a couple steps, right? There's that the building has to be structurally sound. There has to be capital and interest, and that's going to come from whomever the building owner is. But the largest scale projects and the most successful use across cities and across states has to do with government support. So one of the things I find so interesting is that I think probably everyone in this room would feel comfortable saying they support the idea of rooftop farming, but probably none of you have seen an elected official come out and say that they also feel that way, and that's because you need to put the issue in front of them. So one of the things that we've been trying to do with our free time, which just is the winter, like Tuesday nights, is to try and make meetings with local or larger scale representatives and just say, like, this is an issue that's important to us. It's super sexy, and we all want to see the way that this can benefit our city infrastructure. And the reason I keep harping on water is I think that that's a really compelling way to tie it in New York. I know that who visited the Grange? Mayor Bloomberg. Mayor Bloomberg visited the Brooklyn Grange farm, and that was a really exciting moment, even just as a photo opportunity, because it really sent a strong signal that New York City was ready to look at this as part of the way it addressed city infrastructure. So there's a lot of, what is it called? Mouth homage. There's a lot of good verbiage around the idea of growing local food, but I think actually like nailing that in to a concept that's going to have longevity beyond just our immediate interest in farmers markets and local food, and saying like, no, this is something that actually like fundamentally benefits city infrastructure, is a really important part of it. And then on a much larger scale, I mean, I don't want to walk this too far away from what feels locally graspable to all of you, but there's a really unique opportunity in New York right now because this is such a part of the way we talk about food. I think often what's funny about rooftop farming is it's perceived as much more common than it is. And Nicole and I have talked about this on and off about, actually we were talking about it last weekend, about how it seems as though every city in America is doing some form of rooftop farming. But when you really drill down on it, like how financially successful it is, will it exist in 5 to 10 years, the particular model we're talking about, are they actually producing food of any kind of volume? Those are all still pretty open questions. And I would, for the most part, although I'm normally an optimist, be fairly cynical about that. I don't think it's actually moving as quickly as we perceive it to be. So, you know, it's amazing sitting in this space surrounded by Elizabeth's beautiful paintings and feeling like you're in a landscape of prolific rooftop farming. But the reality is this represents 4 rooftop spaces. although we feel quite surrounded. And I think that's pretty similar to what's actually happening in New York. There are a lot of empty roofs still. So where this loops back to you all is an opportunity to think about rooftop farming as one piece of a larger local food system. And I can promise you, as a person who is a ground level grower before I was a rooftop farmer, that it deeply, absolutely matters that you buy from a local farmer's market. The growth of farmers market in New York has been so much more enheartening, makes me so much more happy than what I've seen with local food within the city, because the reality is, at the end of the day, the conversation we're having about what's happening on our roofs is part of our watershed and airshed that extends far outside of our city. And Nicole's point about most food coming from California and Arizona, it's true, I'm sure, even for most of the food you all eat, and you all seem particularly woke because you're here. So what I would encourage you to think about is that, your small efforts on your roof, your local efforts to encourage rooftop farming in New York City, your commitment to purchase from local food growers within our farmers market system, that all should consume, let's just hope 50% of your food dollar. And then after that, we can continue to chip away at that other 50%.
10 years from now, what is your dream, any of you? What could the city look like? What would you want the city to look like?
Oh, let David take that, because he's seen more than 10 years back.
Not that.
No, but you set a precedent, sir, and I want to know what your future vision is.
Yeah, talk into it.
Well, I have a magazine back over there in the corner, and I have an acre of land that sits next to me where we make our jams and jellies in Beckett. And I envision that to be all lavender one day. And someday I'd like to fly over New York City and look down at the rooftops. I'm actually afraid to fly, but I'd like to see lavender everywhere. That would be a beautiful sight, because it is a good plant for honeybees. Lavender honey is very tasty. And that would be my dream. Yeah.
I would say when you asked that question, the first thing that came to mind was there's a pretty iconic New Yorker cover of New York City with green roofs covering all the rooftops. And you can see kids playing, and it's there's grass. When we talk about green roofs, for us, we're talking about food production, but it also can just be covering, it's the rain reflection that we're talking about. So definitely more people spending time on their roofs and having it be an accessible piece of real estate that building owners continue to invest in.
They said it, I don't have anything to add.
No, I mean, I also agree with Nicole. I think there's the 10-year range is a funny one, because my impulse is to actually say, between the next 24 hours, all of you leaving this panel and waking up tomorrow night, eating dinner tomorrow night, and discussing what you'd like to do. The reason I'm involved in the different projects I'm involved in is that per David's point, that education is such an important component of this. I think if you all left this conversation feeling like you had a couple more facts to put before other people, or to just hold in your own hands and think about what change you can make, that really is kind of why we all work our tails off. Because ultimately, I'll speak for myself. I produce food on a very small scale, but I produce information on a very large scale. And that I think is going to be the thing that carries us a little bit further than the postage stamp-sized farm that I work on. In terms of 10 years, I don't know if we could challenge ourselves to think for 100. So Greenpoint is a neighborhood that was farmland in 1730. We have original surveyor's maps that show that. And the reason it drifted away from farmland is because we built up a city and then had this enormous oil spill within the last 30 years that has completely polluted the soil. If you want to look it up, it's the Newtown Creek Exxon Valdez spill, and it's absolutely horrifying when you read the information about the real estate in that neighborhood. So it's part of why we're on a roof, right? So I have to kind of, in some ways, think about the next century instead of the next 10 years, because it's going to take a century or possibly more to heal the actual landscape in which I live in an apartment and my neighbor's garden. And so the challenge, I think, for the next century is knowing that New York City is probably going to continue to grow population-wise. Probably we're going to continue to build relatively hideous condos all along the Brooklyn waterfront. How do we address the fact that that should maintain the green spaces that Nicole talked about? And how can we involve people like you to walk away and not feel frustrated or despondent or have your hands tied, and instead feel empowered and interested and excited? So to that point, our farm's open the last Sunday of the month. Nicole has open hours Wednesday night. David's at the Union Square Green Market every Friday. Wednesday.
Monday, Wednesday, Saturday.
Monday, Wednesday, Saturday.
79th in Columbus on Sunday.
79th in Columbus on Sunday. And when can we hang out with you, Bradley?
I'm around. Catch me if you can.
Bradley's around. But all of us are here as resources to you because we'd like to see you get growing. And Elizabeth was kind enough to let us set up a stand in the back with books on it. It has information about the Brooklyn Grange and Eagle Street Farm. I think Nicole's giving away lettuce. We are here to like push as much as we can into your hands to make this possible. So my next 10 years really relies on all of you.
If you want to get growing, every Wednesday we do these tours, but we're also giving away seedlings. So seedlings being baby plants. So we grow a variety of lettuces and herbs, and we give them out to the community, and we work with a bunch of local schools and nonprofits, and they use these seedlings and they plant them either making like windowsill farms, or they're putting them in like community gardens. So come stop by our greenhouse. It's on top of Whole Foods in Gowanus on a Wednesday night, 6 p.m., and get growing.
I wanted to open it up to the audience for questions or comments.
So hydroponics uses like a 10th amount of water. We recycle all of our irrigation water. But we're also located, the one I was talking about, and the one that is featured in this painting here, is on top of Whole Foods. So they're actually collecting all of the rainwater. It's being pumped into the store, into the bathroom, and it's flushing all the toilets, and it's being used. So if you ever go in there and wash your hands, which you should, you're washing your hands with rainwater. But no, for us, the idea is really that we want to be able to grow year round. And the rainwater collection doesn't really fit into our piece of the puzzle, but I think it's a really important part of a more eco-sustainable city.
So I'm so happy to entertain any engineering or green roof installation questions. You can find me after the panel. The brief answer is I listed a couple of things that are requirements for safety in New York: legal access, legal parapet height, et cetera. And if you're curious about this, if you go to nyc.gov and run a search for green roof.
Green
Roof, right.
not room.
Correct, green roof. There is information online about that. There is also a chockload of information in my book, which is on the back table. But the key thing to understand is if you are feeling enthusiastic leaving tonight about creating a garden on your roof space, I would just encourage you to check that the parapet is 42 inches, that you have access to water, and that you have legal access to the roof, which means when you walk out on the roof, you are on the roof. You're not climbing up through your fire escape, et cetera. Center for Urban Design Lab did a study to calculate how many roofs were over 10,000 square feet and met the FAR standards for weight bearing capacity for green roofs, period. And it was about 6,000 acres. And most of that was concentrated along industrial corridors. So places like where my farm is along the Newtown Creek, places like the Brooklyn Navy Yard where Brooklyn Grange is located. In terms of food production though, it is still an absolute drop in the bucket. And that is a general statement you could make about local food and organic food in our country. Organic food still, I think, is less than 6% of the consumer dollar. But can I just jump in about the wildlife corridor thing? So I'm just going to keep talking. Sorry. So I do want to make a point. Food, on a personal note for me, food has always been the way in which I bring people into the conversation about how important plants and pollinators and green spaces are. I do work for the New York Botanical Garden, and our primary passion is getting anyone to pay attention to plants of any kind, maybe even just mosses, because animals are very interesting, and we have a very soft jealousy of the Bronx Zoo because everyone loves to see animals, but don't you just want to see an oak tree? I don't know. So the reason I got involved in green roof farming is because I care a lot about this infrastructure that green roofs offer, and I figured that food would be the sexiest way to get people on board with those general messages. Care about plants, care about honeybees, care about infrastructure. So just to say one thing about green spaces, one of the discouraging things about growing food is food are a little bit like domesticated pets. They're like the dogs and the cats and the kittens of the world. They're very sensitive. There's a sort of a running theory that if we stopped with meat production and we sort of let out all the cows loose in the world, the cows would just sort of, they wouldn't be able to make it without us. They're so over domesticated. And I feel similarly about a lot of vegetables. So what's really interesting about creating, Nicole made a point about how, you know, we're here as advocates of local food, but we're also here as advocates of general green spaces in the city. Because what I've seen, which is very encouraging, is a trend in green roofs to plant native plant gardens, to plant a field of lavender, to plant plants that have almost a less direct relationship with the way we eat and a more direct relationship with their capacity to create heat mitigation in cities, to do stormwater capture in cities, to create green spaces that make us feel good, you know, because we're all biophilic in one way or another, even if we don't get to recognize it on a daily basis. So I think what's important about this conversation is that if we can get you interested in this movement because we all like to eat and we all care very deeply about our human health, just to remind you that there is a health element to just being in a green space in general. And I'll just say one other thing because I didn't want to let it go. Honeybees are absolutely incredible, intelligent, beautiful, fascinating, gentle, interesting, intelligent, I said intelligent twice, animals. There are 64 species of bees native to the New York City region alone. So when David was mentioning mason bees, you know, this is an important thing to recognize, is that just like we all have a direct relationship to vegetables, but that's one group of plants. Honeybees are just one group of the bee insects that are pollinating through New York. So, you know, even when you're failing at growing lettuce, you can have an opportunity to grow tithonia or something else, some sort of wildflower, and experience other insects in the city. And that's really exciting and interesting, and hopefully, I think, a huge part of the work that you guys are doing at the zoo.
Legislation. In Beckett, Massachusetts, we have 200 acres of land that was for sale around 2007. And this was 200 acres of pristine land. And the day after Thanksgiving, we got a notice from the planning board that Verizon wanted to put a cell tower there. That was next to my property. My wife and my daughter spent night and day researching the effects of EMF on bees, migratory birds, chickens, garlic, you name it. That affected all of those things. We wrote to all our legislators, including Ted Kennedy. We didn't hear back from one except a local man who acknowledged that he received it, that we were opposed to this cell phone tower installation because we thought that it would kill my honeybees. In 2007, January, headlines in the Berkshire Eagle, Verizon pulls its application. They left that location. And that was the end of it. And in that article, they mentioned that I and my wife were opposed to that cell phone tower because we were afraid that it was going to affect the navigation of our honeybees. That today, there is one large parcel that a man bought and built a very big house. Another parcel was sold and he built another house. So there's two houses on that 200 acres. At least there's not a cell phone tower.
That's awesome. Yeah.
But other legislation, does anyone want to talk about?
Annie already mentioned the carrot or the stick. In New York City, you get tax breaks for putting a green roof on, which is good. You could push it further and give more break, or you could do what Germany's done and penalize people for not putting green roofs on new construction. But obviously, there's a lot of other factors involved, and you need to find the right balance. You don't want people to just stop building.
I think probably the easiest thing for most folks to walk out and do is find out who your local council member is, because as David's point proves, it really matters to talk to the guy closest to you. Councilman Levin has been really helpful for us in North Greenpoint, in North Brooklyn. And then the other thing I find really helpful is if you know local groups whose sole focus is to do that kind of work. I do a lot of communication with the, I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget, the Metropolitan Waterfront Alliance, which deals with our shoreline. Locally for me, the Newtown Creek Waterfront Alliance, and then the Open Space Alliance, which does a lot of green space work. So these are all North Brooklyn references, but true to each of your communities and neighborhoods, you have local groups who do advocacy on the heart. If if you're running a Google search, you'd want to look up who cares for my water, who cares for my open spaces. And then another project I found out about recently, you know, we're all rooftop growers, but one of the things that's interesting about New York is that there are a lot of ground level community gardens, and that movement has been very, very strong since the late 60s and into the 70s. And those, of course, are one of the first places lost due to land development. So that's also soil that's collecting stormwater and creating green space and mitigating heat effect. So there are a lot of community garden organizations you could latch onto, because there's always at least one person who's passionate about local politics and will help address some of these kind of questions. So I can't speak to all of New York. Unfortunately, there isn't a really interesting, larger, sexy green roof initiative going through right now, which is maybe an issue of its own. But certainly finding your local council member or these neighborhood groups is a good place to start, because it is on their radar all the time. My time is mostly consumed with actually growing things.
I mean, it's pretty recent. I'm also a member of the Park Slope Food Co-op. I live in Park Slope. I'm active in the community. And I can just say from Gotham Green's experience that, you know, Whole Foods has been like a really important customer of ours, and they've really supported us. They were our first customer, and kind of helped us prove that this could be commercially viable, that, you know, these large-scale businesses were actually interested in buying greens off a rooftop in New York City.
You should explain that you're a tenant of Whole Foods. I don't know if she knows that.
That's a good point. Andy just pointed out that we are not Whole Foods. I should probably point that out, yeah. So we have, Gotham Greens is a separate company, and we started our first greenhouse in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, so close to Annie, in 2011. And then in 2013, we started working with Whole Foods on a project in Gowanus. So they are our landlord, and we have a greenhouse on top of the store. So our farmers are harvesting every morning and then bringing the produce down from the rooftop through the elevator down to the store. We also have a third one in Queens and a fourth in Chicago. So I think, to answer your question about Amazon, I think we have every reason to be hopeful that they're going to continue to support Whole Foods initiatives to support local farmers. I mean, if you walk around Whole Foods, you can definitely see that they highlight local producers, and they really value that. And I think, you know, so far it's been very positive for us, so we're optimistic, yeah.
I learned by just showing up on farms and asking farmers a bunch of questions, and it might be annoying for the farmer sometimes, but there are places you can do it, like at Brooklyn Grange, their Queens location. Every Saturday you can go up there and volunteer, and the farm manager up there, Liz, will definitely take time and answer your questions. You can tell her I said she would. And yeah, she'll give you tasks to do. It might just be harvesting stuff, it might just be weeding, but ask questions while you're doing it. The other thing I would say is Farm School NYC is a great place to, you know, they do like semester long, I don't know how long the courses are, like a couple months, and you do field trips on Saturdays and visit a bunch of different places, different farms, and learn. You get a ton of information. You could also woof. I don't know, you know, it's difficult if you have a, you know, a family or kids or anything. If you're just single, then it's way easier. But WOOF is a website, Willing Workers on Organic Farms, and you can sign up to work on a farm in exchange for room and board anywhere around the world.
Just say one thing. All I would encourage is be patient, because agriculture is a lifelong practice. And I encounter a lot of volunteers who come in and within a season want an expertise that you could not possibly cram into 1 year. And part of that is a function of learning what annual agriculture is. You have to see things through a full cycle many, many times to recognize even something you've read about in a book for years. So for me, I've been in this since 2001, and it was with the investment that it would be a lifetime. There's a culture around agriculture that's really important to commit to. And actually, it just helps you with forgiving your failures. So it's kind of nice to know that even if you spend an entire season weeding, entire season harvesting, which was most of my early experiences, you can watch other people as you grow, and you can make mistakes and have them get erased with time.
One thing that the green market is all about is education, and when you go to a market, you're going to meet the farmer that makes it, grows it, catches it. And I don't think I've missed a market in 25 years. I've always attended these markets. So I welcome people coming to my stand and asking me anything about bees. And I am a small scale grower too. I'm not going to feed the world, I admit it, because I only have my 2 hands. I don't even have a tractor. I use a hoe, a hazel hoe, and a pick, and that's it. But, and I don't use any pesticides, herbicides, or chemical fertilizers. So I do everything by hand. And I have chickens. I know quite a bit about those. I know quite a bit about ducks, and I know a lot about bees. So you can come to the green market and learn there. It's right in your backyard.
That's awesome.